right, Carlton King, the former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation. My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. But actually what we do in the round is we look at geopolitics in the macro and the micro. And today what I want to do is basically bring together two aspects in a more of a critical thinking perspective. So I want to look at the situation with the United States, and the catalyst obviously is the kidnapping of President Maduro. And I might just touch a little bit on the United Kingdom and our Prime Minister Starmer's unwillingness to, in any way, shape or means, condemn that action. An action that, if it was carried out by the Russians, or indeed any other individuals whom we say we don't like, we would turn around and say this is outrageous. But of course we don't. When I say we, the government doesn't. What the government does is it says we need to look at all of the circumstances. Maduro wasn't good for his people, etc., etc. And what's used, and this is where we get to the point that I'm actually going to try and make, is we turn around and we say, because Maduro was not a democrat, he was a dictator, whatever that is. And therefore, because he's not a democrat and was not democratically elected, and again, I will question that, not by me questioning it, but by utilising a very famous individual to question that. Then what we'll do is we will look at the circumstance. And we'll also say that in many other countries you hear exactly the same thing. They're not democratically elected, whatever that means, and how somehow we establish democracy based on how we perceive electoral systems rather than how electoral systems may be in many other lands. So there's that functionality. Yeah, before I go too far, what I should say is, and I did promise it, that the person whom said that the elections of Maduro was positive in terms of was not stolen in any way, shape or means was Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter said something to the effect of the 104 countries, Jimmy Carter, former President of the United States, of the 104 countries in which I have watched elections, the elections in Venezuela were clear and proper. So in other words, Jimmy Carter's saying Maduro didn't steal the elections. Now what I should also say is, of course, that there has subsequently been, since that sort of 2019 statement, or a bit earlier, by Jimmy Carter, there's subsequently been actions by the forces of the Bolivarian Revolution, which is what they call themselves, to prevent law and disorder, rioting, etc., have imprisoned quite a few individuals and have clamped down on massive demonstrations. Of course they have, because the United States set in place openly, in this case, generally not openly, obviously it's hidden, but openly in this case, by none other than President Obama, said that we will take covert actions to try and change the government or to assist the people in Venezuela. And Trump came in and made it very clear that he was going to carry out actions. You know, Trump speaks openly in order to throw out Maduro and put in place people that they want. Originally it was Juan Guaido, wasn't it? And now it's Machado who won the, originally it was her anyway, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, wanting to put them in place to run Venezuela. So what you have is from two presidents, very clear statements. And indeed, Biden continued doing the same thing, trying to cause trouble and strife, trying to undermine the country of Venezuela and thereby carry out regime change. So there you go. You've got one president saying free and fair, seen it, done 104 of them, this is as free and fair as any other. Another president saying relatively covertly, here we are, we're going to write it up, you can carry on various actions, CIA, to undermine and overthrow. Another president, Trump, in his first term, openly stating that he was continuing the actions of Obama to overthrow the state of the president, as he was then, of Venezuela, Maduro. And then you've got the next president, Biden, continuing those actions, not in any way, shape or means lessening those actions, trying to get civil society against Maduro, etc., etc. And then finally, you've got the president back in again, Trump, who then, it's not working by trying to do it via causing trouble and strife and causing fizzes within the society. He's going to do it by actually spending billions to put the strongest naval armada, as he said, the world's greatest has ever seen, I can't do his accent so I shouldn't try, on the Caribbean seas to pressure and kill 100 people in boats who are moving out of Venezuela. God knows what the people have done, and bringing up some stories about basically, oh, they're all drug carriers when they're 1,000 miles away from the United States. But, whatever it is, the bottom line is that 100 people were killed doing that, extrajudicially killed, no authority whatsoever. And when the president asked, he said, we just kill them. Those are his words. We just kill them. Anybody we want, we kill. Anybody we want, we kill them. Those are his words. I'm not making that up. You can see this on one of his, it was on the news in general, but you can see it on the internet. So what I'm saying is that this is how the system of so-called democracy works, by claiming something isn't democratic because you're forcing the people to take action to defend themselves. And the moment they take action to defend themselves, you say they're not democratic. So we go on. But I also want to, and so that's where the democratic aspect comes into play. But I also want to actually go back and give some sort of historical perspective to it, and then move forward from the historical perspective. So bear with me, people. If you're interested at all in any way, shape or means in politics, if you're interested at all in any way, shape or means in geopolitics, how the world functions together, if you're interested in any way, shape or means on what actually affects you on the political field, falling down into your everyday life, please do listen to us. And please do subscribe. Just press the subscribe button. I want as many people to subscribe as possible. Please enjoy. We are audio only. If you want, actually write in and say whether you think we should become actually videoed. But for now, we're audio only, so you can listen to it in the car as you're driving along, or if you've got your headphones on as you're running down the street, or as you're, if that's what you do, jogging, or if you're in the supermarket shopping. You can listen to it as an audio, how podcasts were meant to be originally, before many of them went into what we would call them now being videocasts. So thanks. Bear with me, ladies and gents. Thank you for that. Let's first look at the situation. Now, if we're going to look at democracy, I guess the way we look at it in the West, we say it's from the Greek demakos, and meaning of the people and that sort of business. Whether that's true or not, don't know. It may be linguistically true, but does that mean that the Greeks had the first democracy? Well, I think that's total and utter rubbish. There's democracies in many parts of the world, particularly amongst more connected peoples. I don't want to use the word tribal because it's a pejorative word. I don't want to use that. It gives an idea of some sort of backwardness. Well, then, when that's not actually the case. If you look going back in time, a lot of societies in Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas, they had real democratic systems. And Africa, to be fair, in many parts of Africa, not by any means all parts, but in certain parts of Africa, up to relatively recently, 300-400 years ago, they also had very democratic systems in some parts, because Africa had its empires, Africa had its kings and its queens and its rulers, but in some countries they didn't have that. And what they had was a system whereby, everybody would sit together and make every decision collectively. The problem with that process, of course, is that you can possibly not get things done. Depending upon what is the calculation as to whether something is passed by this democratic forum or isn't. If the calculation is that it's just one person who is above and beyond whatever the question is. So if the question is yes or no correct, right? If you have 100 people and 51 of them say yes is correct, whatever the answer is, it doesn't matter what the point is, then that is democratically held and it moves forward. If that's the question, but no, in a lot of these states, actually, particularly African ones that I'm familiar with, and it's probably the same case in many other places, what it was a unanimous decision. And I don't mean a provisional unanimous decision. I mean an actual unanimous decision. Everybody had to agree. Now, that might mean every man had to agree. Now, in some places, it was women had the rights. You talk about the Amazonians. So few and far between, I must admit, on the continent. But sometimes women were the ones who made the votes and had the right. And in other places, duality, both men and women voted. But generally, if you look at it historically and properly, you would argue that the vast majority of places were that the men made the decisions, and that decision had to be unanimous. In many places, everybody had to agree. Then, of course, I guess they found that you didn't get things done. So I guess they orientated themselves to, okay, let's say a certain percentage. And it might then be that some places say 75%, whatever. And then, I guess, just a mere majority. So just one person above and beyond the others. And then you've got areas where people could abstain. So then what's the majority if you can't get it because they've abstained? Do you put the abstentions together with the no's? How does that work? Or do you put them together with the yeses? So you see how easy and complex so-called democracy can become. And then you bring in democratic systems whereby you say there's several different parties and those parties are whipped, like in the United Kingdom, for example, oftentimes. And that means that in order for you to be part of the party and keep the party's whip and to belong to the party on certain things, it's a 3-line whip, so you have to vote in a certain way. So again, how is that democratic? Because now you're not voting from your own free will as a representative of the people, and I haven't got to that yet, representative of the people. You're voting on what the particular party says. Then you go to our point of democracy in the United Kingdom and in many other places, where you become a representative democracy. That is, you get voted in on a vote every 5 years. This would be your MP, Member of Parliament, or deputy, or representative, or depending on what country you're in, you can give it whatever name you want. And they're then voted in by the people once every 5 years. And basically, because of the way the systems work, you have a choice between often just 2 parties, sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 if you're in, say, Italy, maybe 20, 30 if you're in Italy or somewhere like that. But then it's only a percentage of them that can get through to be deputies, or you need a percentage level before that particular party can be perceived as a party, and therefore you know, let's say the Monster Raven Looney Party in Italy wouldn't get enough votes to be able to be seen in the party process under any type of electoral system which is not first past the post and becomes a representative sample. So then somebody's deciding who is a representative sample of the people who are put forward for the vote. Then you have what percentage of the people who are put forward for the vote may be perceived as having won the vote based on an issue and based on a geographic area known as a constituency, etc., etc., etc. I'm just talking about the Western systems generally. Then there might be systems of the Communist Party system example, whereby you have to be part of the Communist Party and then you can get voted in as a representative for that particular area against other people who want to stand as a representative for that particular area, and then or that you're hoisted and said, you will become our representative. Now, in some of those systems, in many ways, it could well be seen that they are, in some ways, more democratic because they have a recall back not within the period of time. So, in other words, instead of it being an established period of time for which you voted in, it could be because you're not doing what the people want you to do. You could be recalled to the system and say, you're no longer our representative, we put somebody else forward. So there's a whole host of different ways of so-called democracy. Then, you know, and some of them just, you may be listening and you may be thinking, well, yeah, but those are just ideals. They don't really matter, don't really make a difference. Well, it does, doesn't it? Because let's just give you two examples. For those who listen to the show regularly, you'll know that I'm a black guy, and that's why it's called the Black Spy Podcast, because I was a spy and I was black. Right, so, I'm black. So therefore, you know that's the name of the show. So because I'm black, obviously a lot of blackish and black perspective comes to me, in addition to everybody else's perspective, because I'm just on a one-horse town. You know, I look at things from all different angles, or attempt to, as much as I can, which is relatively easy for me because of where I was brought up, who I was brought up with, in addition to my family, and who I perceive to be my family, in addition to my actual family. So, you know, so it's easy for me to take on this perspective of many other people, be it because there are a certain class of individuals, be it because of a certain colour of individuals, be it because they trace their heritage in a certain way, you know, so they've been English for forever and a day as they perceive it. You know, for me, I've got a very rounded view of what somebody might be or is. But there is a perspective that I often articulate because it's not articulated by many others. And that's often the perspective of being black. And I'm not really saying African, Asian, whatever. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying black, a coloured perspective, because we work on colour oftentimes. And we perceive things from the perspective of that person can't be that because of their particular colour. And obviously I go into the historical areas that show that that's not true in many cases. But this is a different area, so I'm not going to go into that. But I'm just explaining my points so people don't think I'm only going down one angle. So if you look at the United States of America and 1776, its revolution, etc., etc. At the time of the revolution, you could argue that the black populace in that country was about 19-20%. The majority enslaved, you know, but there's questions about what that majority is. Is that 80%? Is that 90%? Is it 60%? Does it encroach later on? Are they, at the time of the revolution, are they enslaved forever? And will their offspring be enslaved? Or are just they enslaved? More like an indentured servant, but enslaved. You know, because there are treaties that come into place subsequently which say that if you are a black person, your children will enslave, your children are enslaved, and you're born enslaved and you become enslaved. That becomes after the 1776. It becomes, if you will, official statute law in many states after that of the Commonwealth of the United States. So that's the perspective there. But if you want to put it together, as part of the Republic of the United States, you're looking at, as I said, about 20% of that population black, and let's say 90% enslaved. You know, some of them do give figures like that, some of them say even higher. So whatever the circumstances, but let's give it 90%. So let's say 18% of the population are black of the United States, and none of them have rights. So is that a democracy? Because we herald that as the great democratic state. But already at the inset, at its outset, at the beginning of its processes, X amount of people, a good fifth of the population cannot vote. A fifth of the population are classed as 4/5 of a person. Why is that the case? Because you could argue that why would he make them anything of a person at all? Well, the reason for that is because in the southern states, where you had the majority of black people, in order to get their numbers up, so when they come into the representative or into the House of Representatives or into the Senate, to have their numbers up, you needed a population count. Well, what better than to count the blacks as a population, but then to say they can't vote because they're blacks and they're enslaved. So you've got your bit that allows you to get your representative into Parliament with higher numbers and therefore more power, but it prevents the blacks having, because in some states, of course, blacks were half of the population. So if you give them the right to vote, they're not going to vote for themselves to be enslaved, are they? So you stop the vote, but you get the power using the bodies in this term as a voter mechanism, in order for you to get more votes without them having the right to vote. So in other words, what you're basically saying is that the slave owner is voting for them all and saying, I've got 580 souls or whatever, and they all vote for this guy, right? Which gives the slave owner power. So you see what I'm saying? This is how democracy, so-called democracy, can be played with in the beginning. And you say, but that's 300-400 years ago. Okay, let's bring it up to the modern era. Muhammad Ali, practically everybody listening will understand who Muhammad Ali is, greatest boxer of all time, arguably. That man, when he came back from winning the Olympics in 1960, couldn't sit down at a normal, they call it a dining table in America, but they call them a diner table in America, and eat his food with everybody else, because he was black. Right? He wasn't allowed to sit there. So he actually threw his medal away. He said, I've got this medal for the United States, and this United States doesn't allow me to do anything. And then subsequently, when they wanted him to fight in the Vietnam War, he said, no, I'm not fighting. And he said, no Vietnamese ever called me an N. Why should I call an N? You can figure out what the rest of the words are. It's like Niger. Why would I fight for a country that holds me captive to kill people who've never called me a negative name? Ever. Never done anything negative to me at all. Why would I fight for that country? And what he's articulating is he doesn't have proper voter rights, because voting rights were suppressed still. And voting rights in the United States for people of colour, black people, to be precise, and by this time, you're talking about, a good 50, 60, 70 million people, potentially. Now I'll have to check those figures. I may not be right on but it was the high millions of individuals weren't allowed to vote correctly in the southern states. Yeah? Literally weren't allowed to vote because they had a whole host of voter, what did they used to call them? Voter anomalies, which you had to basically be able to pass in order to vote. And it's voter suppression in reality. And basically some of them were as bad as, can you read this Hebrew here? And if you can't read Hebrew, that's you done, mate. You can't vote. Or did your great-great-grandfather vote? Well, no, he didn't. Well, he didn't because he was enslaved. So therefore, you cannot vote. Bosh, that's you done. That's the end of it. So where was the democracy? And the reason why I use the United States, not because I dislike them, because I don't, but the reason why I use it is because every other country was turning around saying, the United States is the shining light. This is the beacon of democracy. Well, how can you be the beacon of democracy when your own people can't vote or are suppressed from voting in half of the states of the Union? Right? When everything negative is happening to a whole percentage of people based on their colour. I mean, even senators Republicans, let's say House of Representatives, even representatives have gone down south in that era and have been told, you ain't nobody down here, you just a plain old N, right? By some hick person who can't even add 3 and 3 together, right? You know, I'm not talking about now, this is coming from some other reasoning. I'm just saying, based solely on the man's skin, right? This is the problem. But the whole world turned around and said, the whole world, that supposedly the Western world, read for that Europe, and the allied parts, which would in those days have been Japan, South Korea, Indonesia when it was turned from Suharto, from his independent stance, and obviously so-called anti-communist wars were fought against them. But anything that was allied with the United States looked to the United States and basically said, whole of South America, North America, Central America, basically turned around and said, oh yeah, US is the most democratic place on earth. I mean, we in the United Kingdom, we're extremely democratic, right? So that's the black issue. I've just used that. And that goes for the whole of South America, basically. And even today, this is how I spin it to today, you look at Venezuela, and one of the biggest gripes in Venezuela, and one of the biggest gripes for the American expatriates from Venezuela into the United States, who tend to be white, let's use the word white, or lighter skinned, is that under Hugo Chavez, a much darker skinned, clearly black person, right, that they'd taken control. But the control rights were ours, white skinned or very light skinned South Americans and Central Americans, and that these people had usurped their power, which again was the biggest gripe with the Cuban Revolution, that Castro brought a lot of blacks into the Cuban Revolution and pushed out a lot of the landowners who, for landowners, read slave owners previously, okay? And that's the reason why you have that. Again, for the ruling elites in South America, they all had big slave nations, all the way down and including of Argentina. Let's not misunderstand that. The first president of Argentina was a mixed race guy. Argentina, when it pushed off the yoke of, as they would perceive it, the yoke of Spain, was a mixed race guy. They have obliterated him from their history. The people who fought in the revolution to free Argentina were generally blacks. And indeed what they do say is, yes, a lot of blacks fought for freedom in Argentina. That is true, but most of them died out via tuberculosis and other plagues. And therefore, generally, Argentinians are white. No, what really happened is after the First World War, you basically went out and said, we want immigration into Argentina and only white people need apply. And they specifically went out for Italians from the north. Understand that as well, from the north, not the south. It's the same way as Australia, and this is, I'm trying to bring it together so you can understand it. Same way as Australia had the Australia white policy, and of course you were only allowed to emigrate to Australia as a 10 bob pom in the 50s, in the 60s, or a 10 bob Greek or whatever, if you appeared to be white. And there is, I did some work with, when I was in the branch, with an ASIO guy, that's the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, a great lad. He was a northern lad from the UK, his family were northern from the UK. They went out in the later 10 bob poms, and he was stationed here in the United Kingdom. And he and I got on very, very well. And I was looking at Australia, at some Australian stuff, but particularly with Wikinga stuff, and how that interconnected with anti-communism, etc., which we were working on. And he was a good lad. And we were discussing Australia, and he said, yeah, we were out and out racist. That's him saying it to me. We're out and out racist. He said that there's even files, and this is what he said to me, there's even files here in the High Commission, right? Because obviously he was stationed in London, he's stationed at the High Commission. He even files here in the High Commission whereby a guy has turned up to emigrate to Australia. He, what's he called? Bert Whitlock was the president at the time. And there was the Australia white policy, very clear policy, only allow white people in. It went to every High Commission, every Australian embassy, only allow white people in to Australia to emigrate. And this guy came in, not your average 10-bob pom, because he had a couple of quid with him, enough to allow him to go to the south of France on holiday with his family, because him and his family are emigrating. So he came in, and he was your everyday, average Briton, light-skinned, etc., etc. Okay, good, it's looking good, come back at such a time. So the original immigration officers looked at it, and then this geezer came back in. I use the colloquialism of geezer because I think he's a Londoner, but relatively wealthy, made a couple of quid somewhere. And he'd been to, which was quite abnormal then in those days, he'd been to the south of France for his holidays, right? And he'd come back, and he'd been sunbathing, and he was dark. And they stamped on it, no. He's got a touch of the tar brush, as a guy said to me. We figured that he might be not white. That was him done. That was the end of his emigration to Australia and his family's. So that's the level that it was held at in those days. And that's only the 1960s. And the files still sit in the embassy. He was laughing, chuckling at it. We were having a chuckle. So this is what you get. This is what you need to understand. So what's democratic? So let's look at another angle of this democracy. And when you talk about the Australians, what is the democratic perspective for the indigenous Australians? Where do they sit in the Australian Parliament? I think you had one parliamentarian who is of Aboriginal heritage, or she may even be actually a Torres Islander rather than an Aboriginal Australian. So what you're getting is, in a lot of these countries, particularly in settler states, where people have settled, even under the auspices of Great Britain, as in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, etc., 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 Canada, so ex-Brits who've gone out, you're getting this ideal of a colonial perspective and whether you can emigrate there, which ties together with your rights and all the rights that you don't have if you're an indigenous person of colour. So this is what you found. So where is the democracy based on that? But we're saying we're so democratic. Another example, we're saying we're so democratic. Women, as we know, didn't have the vote in the United Kingdom. And it didn't matter what level of woman you were. You didn't have the vote in the United Kingdom. Even if a queen was sitting on the throne, you didn't have the vote. So how could that be democratic? Now, let's go the step further, which I often have to say to people who look at suffragettes. The vast majority of men didn't have the vote either. Right. So in the First World War, all the way up to the end of the First World War, the vast majority of men, one, on age, i.e. you had to be 21, but secondly, and that would be okay if you were under 21 and weren't allowed to do anything. But if you're under 21, but you can still join the army and die for your country, then that's problematic, isn't it? If you can join the army at 18, and by the way, in the First World War, many were joining at 16, 17, and yes, officially, they probably had to lie about it, or at least the recruiting sergeant said they lied about it, right? But you were going to war, dying for your country, but you couldn't vote. So how democratic is that? And then, that's just on age, and then you had the right to vote, which many couldn't vote regardless of how old they were, because they weren't property-owning classes or of a certain ilk of person above below the property-owning class, because you're in a certain role, which you might have been a property-owning class, but you were renting, etc., and it gave you a right to vote. So I think there wasn't universal suffrage. I think the suffrage for men might have been at the level of 50%, if that. If that. I should look up the actual figures. I ain't got time, but look it up yourself, because I like to give this, but I don't want to do all the work for you. Go and look it up. See what the actual suffrage allowance was for the United Kingdom. up to 1918, 1919. Okay, so the vast majority of these guys, particularly working class people, couldn't work. Okay, some of the factors were educational. Now, the system educated you to work the machinery. So oftentimes that meant by the time you were 12, some places 10, in Great Britain, United Kingdom, you then left school to go and work in the factory. Because you needed enough education to work the factory system, but not too much education to question how the system worked. Right? So again, it's a balancing act. Is that democratic? Does everybody have a right under a democracy? I ask you that question. What I'm trying to do with this is just give you a view of what democracy is, right? To answer the bigger questions that are running today. And that's the historical perspective thereof. And then the women, as you know, didn't vote at all. And basically the ruling class women who wanted the vote, basically Emmeline Pankhurst, etc., basically said, we want to vote in line with our men. So in other words, they were happy just to vote in line with ruling elite men, ruling elite women. Right? Those who'd been given the vote, the allowance to vote as men, the women of that ruling elite wanted it in the same way. They weren't asking for votes for working class women at all, in any way, shape or means. Right? For the vast majority of them. I'm sure there was the odd ruling elite woman who did think that. And this is not something that's actually really hidden. I mean, you can watch something as openly basic as Mary Poppins. And when you look at the Mary Poppins, you'll see that the woman asking for universal suffrage for women of her ilk is the ruling person in the household. I can't remember what her name is. And she comes in saying, it was absolutely fantastic. And Mary Poppins, as you know, is the governor of the children of this woman. And the cooks are there and the maids are there. None of them were going to get a vote. And none of them was being a look for the suffrage. And in the United States, even wealthy black women, and there were some wealthy black women, in fact, one of the wealthiest women in the United States in the early 1900s was, I've forgotten her name. She's a person who invented basically iron combing, straightening black people's hairs, etc. Madam, what do they call her? She had a house on the same road as the Vanderbilt. She was extremely wealthy, the first woman self-made millionaire, a black woman. She couldn't vote, right? So it's not people just marrying their husband. This is her couldn't vote. And of course, when she put herself forward with other wealthy black women, and there were quite a number, particularly in the northern states, they were told, actually, could you be at the back of the demonstration? Do not come to the front of the demonstration. So you see, even if you get the right to vote, does it mean that it's democratic? Or even if you're pushing for the right to the vote, is it democratic? Or do you always know where you're going to be when that democracy pushes forward? Why is this all important? Because when we look at the issues as they stand right now, we love to call people non-democratic. We love to call them dictators. Now, 1990s, I was running a section of the special branch at the airport, and I had a team of guys. I split my people up into various teams, and one of them we were looking at Russians. And generally at the time, it was more the Russian mafiosa. You look, after the fall of Russia, and into the mid-90s, Russia was a basket case. I'm talking now the Russian Federation. Soviet Union's fallen. Russian Federation was a basket case. And people were dragging money out of it left, right and centre. And the mafiosi had taken over because whereas people were given certain amount of rights, when companies which had previously been owned by the state were handed to individuals, their rights, these, the strong, the mafiosa, basically went in and said, you don't want those vouchers, do you? Those vouchers are now mine. And if you basically said, I do want them, you probably died. But when you didn't, then boom, that's it. Thank you very much. And I'll give you threepence for them. And they took the vouchers. And that's how you get your oligarchs. And at one stage, 12 people owned something like 9% of the wealth of the Russian Federation. And indeed, more importantly, all of the massive, and I do mean massive, entities of gold, diamonds, oil, etc., under the ground in the Russian Federation. Right? Now, 12 people owned all of that. Putin came in, and what he did is he said, not having it, because under Yeltsin that was the case. Yeltsin was a drunk, as everybody knows, and basically was happy to sell over to the United States and some other Western nations, but not really through. The United States really got the vast majority of what was coming over to them and United States companies. Well, this Putin guy came in, and Bill Byrne, former CIA director, former Russian ambassador, actually there's a communicator cable secret cable sent from the US embassy in Russia, which came out on WikiLeaks, so you can read it. It's on the internet, whereby Bill Byrne articulates that he tried to pay Putin his money as Yeltsin was being paid, and Putin pushed back the envelope. Not interested, mate. I'm a Russian patriot. Right. So I tell you that, and please look all this up. I tell you that because the problem for President Putin has been that he hasn't sung to the hymn sheet of the United States. We went into a system with one superpower, and what Putin has attempted to do since is, in his mind, and probably in the minds of most Russians, because it's in the minds of us Brits, is to bring Russia back to where it belonged. The same way as Brits say, we want to bring Britain back to where it belonged as the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Now, we don't articulate it in the greatest empire the world has ever seen, but what we do articulate in is its rightful place as a powerful country. And our politicians still play that game when we are no longer a powerful country and can't afford it. But we try to still play that game, and it's one of the biggest problems that we have, actually, and it causes us no end of grief. But that's what we do. So we allow for the National Health Service and various other homegrown and internal entities to wither because we're playing at being the top guy on the street on the world stage. And frankly, it does us no favours. But that's another show at another time, and has been a previous show of mine. So you can look that up. But the point I'm making is this. Putin doesn't bend over. He actually brings Russians back from literally, I told you I was looking at it, looking at Russia, literally women in their 70s and 80s selling themselves for food. Right? And you know what I mean by that. And young women from some of the top previous Soviet universities, when asked the question, what do you want to be? They turned around and said, a dollar prostitute, because they needed the money. Right? And they didn't want the rubles. So this is where the mighty Russia had fallen to. But, this is the point I make, over the period of time, Putin has brought them back from that ilk whereby the head of the Soviet Missile Command, right, who subsequently becomes the Russian Soviet Command, is driving a taxi to get paid, and he's controlling Russians' nuclear weapons at the time. Right, back in the 90s. He's moved them from that to a period of respect. And you're going to try and tell me that he has no support in Russia? You're dreaming. And this is why I say to people, educate yourself. So he has support, and hence it is not abnormal for this guy to be voted back into power by people particularly of my era and ilk and age, and much younger, who in the 1990s saw Russia as nothing and now see Russia again as something. Right? So that alone is going to give you the vote. Right? So don't turn around and say these people are not democratic. And this is why I mentioned what I did with Maduro, and before him Chavez, who Maduro worked from Chavez. Again, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, I should explain. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela brought Venezuelan people, the average people now, not the wealthy Venezuelans, the average people. Add to that now, people of colour, brought them up. And so those people vote first for Hugo Chavez, and now for Maduro. So there is, like it all over it, there is popular support for these people because they see, and yeah, they may be taking a couple of quid for themselves, but don't all these leaders? Frankly, I don't care what country you're in, don't they all? You know, they may be looking after themselves. That's what they tend to do. But they've done something for their nation, right? And this is the point that we don't want to hold on to. Now, if you want to say that, we all know, because he says it, that's the beauty of President Trump in the United States. He says he's making money for himself. He says it. He says my family's making money. He says it, my friends are making money. Hey, this guy's made this amount of money today because of what I did. He says it. So they're all at it. He says it. This is the difference. The problem is you've got a one-time monolithic only superpower for about 20 years to it now having to share that power structure with other states, primarily China and Russia. So now, what this is that's happening right now as we sit, speak, live, and understand what democracy supposedly is, we are bombarded with perspectives of negativity on particularly China, Russia, add to that Iran, add to that North Korea, add to that any country that isn't going to bend, add to that now Venezuela, any country that isn't going to bend to the United States, add to that Greenland. Right, I'm going to tell you something now. Watch over the next few months and see how many stories you will see in the press about Greenland. Right? Normally, you will see on average 0 stories about Greenland. But mark my words, you're going to see on television, you're going to see in the press, you're going to hear on the radio, you're going to hear stories that turn around and say, well, Denmark's been running Greenland for this amount of time. And you know what? A lot of the time they've been negative. They've been racist, they've been this, they've been that. They've treated Greenlandic people badly, blah, 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 blah. That notion, some of it reality, but unreported previously, is now going to be reported. Watch soon where you will get Greenlanders demonstrating for their rights. Watch it. Watch it come along. You'll get Greenlanders who will soon say, oh, I want my rights. I've not been getting them. I want this, I want that, I want the other. Watch it. Because that's the way the game's played. You know I was in secret intelligence. Anybody who listens to this knows that. That's the way the secret intelligence game is played. You will heat up, and in national security, and the other side of it, looking at others trying to do that, to cause fizzes, cause problems within our society. This is what will be now caused by the United States agencies, right? They will be working at causing problems in Greenland. And before you know it, the Greenlanders will start saying, we're going to be better off in the United States, right? Mark my words. There'll be representatives in Greenland, in the Greenland Council, who'll start saying, you know what, I think we're better off in the United States. Because, of course, they'll be paid well. The monies, you see, follow the money. The operation against Venezuela so far has cost something like 8 to 10 billion, right? Some say 4. Let's give it the full gambit. Let's say from 4 billion to 10 billion. Give it the full gambit, right? Because what you're talking about is stationing ships there, people there, operations, buying people. That's what you got to look at, buying people, right? All of a sudden, Maduro has $50 million on his head. This sort of money buys a lot of people, right? So you're talking about buying people. People have been paid off. People have been paid off to stand down, except during that operation, etc., 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 right? Those monies will not be, I don't think, will not come back to the United States in just taking Venezuela. I think that those monies will be difficult for the United States to recuperate. Now, I'm going into a little bit of a different angle because I'm looking at time and I want to do this in one session. If you look at the United Kingdom's colonies. Let's take Kenya, because I know that very well. Again, I was running that section, I know that very well. Right, so the Kenyan situation. When the United Kingdom took over Kenya, right, what is it, 1890 or something like that, 1897, something like that. Don't quote me on the timings. The area that we now call Kenya. It was called the East African Protectorate or something like that at the time. Basically, the first thing that the Colonial Office writes is, how is this colony going to pay for itself? Right, first thing it writes, how is this colony going to pay for itself? And if you know anything about colonies, and you know about colonial systems, all the colonies have to pay for themselves. Because if there isn't a net gain for the colony, what's the point of the colony? You know, we grabbed the colony to get the net gain from the colony, right? Obvious colonies like South Africa, hey, there's gold there, there's diamonds there, there's bauxite there. Oh, fantastic, brilliant, ours. Grabbed it, boom, ship it out to United Kingdom, job done. Some even, you know, in Egypt. Take Egypt's a good one. Oh, Egypt's producing cotton. Great. Let's grab it under the Anglo-Indian, Anglo-Egyptian and Sudanese protectorate. Let's grab that. We'll have that because they're getting cotton. We'll destroy their cotton system. We'll put the cotton in northwest of England, and it will sell it back to these numbers of people, millions of people actually, that are there. And also we can build other things for them, trains, blah, 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 which they have to pay for, and therefore we'll make money off their back. Boom. And it's strategically important because there's strategic aspects as well. So we're building this canal that'll cost money, but will make us money, etc., etc. The Suez Canal. So that's how they look at it. You look at it from the perspective of what is in it for us. Yeah. Now, there's a whole lot of other issues that are being played, but follow the money because that's the number one thing. And people's hands may be pushed. Other Brits may go in there and start opening stuff up as they did in the British periods. But in this one, East Africa, Kenya, where are we making our money from? Flipping heck, how do we make our money out of this? But when we look around geologically, it doesn't look particularly 100% that we're getting a lot of stuff out of it. Plantations. Let's make a plantation. Right, so what they do is they force the Kikuyu people and other indigenous peoples of Kenya into basically reservations. They then, once they're in these reservations and in urbanisations, all they can really do to make money, because otherwise they're going to starve, is to work for these companies which are then set up, tea, coffee, whatever it might be, whatever else they want to plant. Brilliant. And then you put a couple of white settlers there who control it, and you work hand in hand generally with some of the local chiefs. You always got to turn some of the locals in, because what you want to happen is you can't station so many soldiers there all the time that, again, it's such a burden of cost. So what you want is local soldiers. You make them part of the British Empire. So, you know, you are part of Empire now. We are the mother country. You work with us. And you have the local chief who articulates that, the local boss, the local emperor, whatever he is, right? Who articulate, and if he doesn't, you top him and put somebody else in. Top, British language means kill him, and put somebody else in who will do that job, and then you run it under them. So if there's a backlash, they're backlashing against their own people rather than the colonial people that are running it, the whites that are running it, or in this case, calling them white because it's a British Empire running it, or anybody else, and we're relating it to Kenya. So that's how you do it. So you make the anger come to the locals, but obviously always white officers running it until it comes to the very top, and then they show some reverence to the local leader to some extent, but not too much, because at the end of the day, everybody knows who's actually running it. That's the way it works, and then you get the people working. The guy who is the chief or whatever, he gets more money than everybody else, and he puts his money into London, so it's a win-win because the money's gone back into a London bank anyway. So great, hey, we're all winning all through. And he holidays in London, buys places in London, etc., etc., etc. This is the way it used to work, and therefore the monies are always flowing back to the mother country, and everybody's happy, right? Other than the local people who are working in sweatshops and dying like flies, to get the crops out and never win past subsistence. The problem is that it creates a class of the local elite class who are orientated towards the rulership from the colonial power, so don't really care about their own people anymore, and they are told and articulated that that's the norm, and you're living well, thank you very much anyway, because you got your house in London or wherever else you've got your houses, and everybody's happy. So it's got to pay for itself. So that's the first thing they ought to. How does it pay for itself? I'm suggesting to you that we look at Venezuela, and I'm saying it doesn't pay for itself because of the long years of sanctions ever since Chavez was in 2013 or whatever, or 29, whenever Chavez came to power. There've been sanctions against it by the American. They've because he he did actually up the levels of oil obtained by the Venezuelan peoples rather than by the American companies. That's the first thing that made the Americans angry, because they took away the 75% general rule. It's about 80 to 75%, which you do. Same with Gaddafi in Libya. Generally, you start off with 80 to 75% goes to the oil company, and the ruling elite gets 15, 20%, and it makes them happy because they're only looking after themselves, right? No, these people who believe to be patriots for another reason why they've come in, they say, no, let's spin that around. You'll get 20% and we take the 80%. That then becomes problematic, and then that's where the military go in. But the military went in covertly in those old days. Now, with President Trump, he don't care. He just says, no, we want our oil back. We're going to take our system. And it's not really because the oil's going to make them that much money. It's because it teaches others who may have considered saying, well, we're going to change our system. It teaches you never to do that. Because if you do that, you're going to end up in a prison in the United States. Right? You and your missus are going to end up in a prison in the United States for doing what you've done. And what you've done, basically, is say, we want to be independent of that system. We want to run our own affairs. Even if it's run badly. And as I said, everybody makes a few pounds for himself. It seems that's to be the way. So why wouldn't they? You know, it amazes me. It absolutely amazes me how people come into Parliament, United Kingdom, not so much, to be fair, not on the scales of Americans, or go into the House of Representatives or into the Senate, even more so, as relatively wealthy people, and come out extremely wealthy people. How does that work? How do you go into the House of Representatives with a relative amount of wealth, but come out as multimillionaires? I mean, their salary's not that much. Were they making that money? This is what I'm saying. So please don't be fooled by the fact that these people in these other lands make money. Of course they do. And I'm not saying that they're great people. I'm just saying this is how the systems work. And this is how we are being bombarded with nonsense. But, oh, they're doing this and they're doing that and they're doing the other. No, they're nasty. And yeah. No, oftentimes it's as simple as these people spoke out and therefore have now got to be dealt with. And the worst aspect is now, and this is what I'll end on, the worst aspect is today is that because the United States is feeling the heat of losing the number one slot, it is now like any other empire you can think about, from Egyptian to Greek to Roman to Chinese to you can go on and on and on and on, Mongols, empire to whatever. Once they start losing, they start kicking out. Right? That's just the way it is. You start losing that power, so let's now try and find out why we're losing that power. And to some, they say, let's bring the whole system down with us. Now, that's okay 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, from the empires I've told you about 5,000 years ago. That's okay then, because you're not going to destroy the whole world. But it isn't okay today when the capacity is there to destroy the whole world, because the people you're trying to keep down from now taking up the new role of being the leaders of the world, they have got comparable weaponry to you. So whereas you try to force them to not take on that power by force of arms, they're going to say, well, we're going to defend ourselves with the same arms you have. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what can lead to the end of the world. Right? The end of the world. If you haven't seen it, watch it. A House of Dynamite. It's by the great director who did Zero Dark 30, Catherine Bigelow. And I think that the movie that she portrays is just how simple one nuclear weapon being fired, how that can bring about the end of the world. And we are playing around now with extremely, extremely dangerous situations. You are looking at a Europe which, because it's led its people up a hill and has said that the war in the Ukraine is a war for all our independence and that Russia wants to take over all the world, total and utter nonsense. The reason why I say it's total and utter nonsense, you only need to look to one of Great Britain's prime ministers who lasted, Liz Truss said, she said this war, and this was her quoting it, and that's probably why she wasn't a good prime minister. She said this war is about degrading Russia, not about anything else. And indeed, she was one who said, ex-British servicemen should actually go and fight on the side of the Ukrainians. Something that's totally illegal, by the way. And if you did it for any other country, you could come back to the United Kingdom and find yourself being charged with an offence. But anyway, that's what she said. So she let the cat out of the bag, saying basically this is about degrading Russia, not about the Ukraine. And you can see that. It was on the internet, so you can see it fully. You can see the speech. I mean, the speech was there at the time and subsequently was put onto the internet. So look it up. Again, as I say with all these things, look it up. It's about degrading Russia. Why? Because there's some sort of Russophobia in the United Kingdom. Don't know why, but it's there. Right? So, down to the point of the Russians have blown up their own $1 billion pipeline. Why would you do that? And then you get Sweden and then subsequently Denmark, and now the Germans trying a new tune saying, the Swedes and the Danes say, well, we know who's done it, but we won't say because it's not in our national interest. Well, if it were Russia, it would be in their national interest to say the Russians did it. The Germans come out with some cock and bull stories on other issues. But the bottom line I'm saying is that all of this is the media in full unison with government turning around saying this is what it's about. Now, I'm a patriotic Englishman, and I believe in doing what's right for our nation. But what I don't believe in is actually putting ourselves in harm's way, which is why before Iraq war, before the Afghan war, when I was working in the agencies, I was saying, do not involve ourselves in these wars, because we will be the ones who pay the price, because we are not the United States. We're not as powerful as the United States. We don't have the capacity to defend ourselves the same way the United States does. And we will lose out. We will lose out. And indeed, we got practically none of the contracts in Iraq. And wars, I always say follow the money, and wars are about the money. So we got practically none of the contracts to rebuild Iraq, got none of the oil. We got none of anything, to be fair, to our advantage for the loss of the individuals, which weren't many, to give you to be truthful about it. But every death is a death, and many, many more were injured. Why? What did we get out of it? Nothing. Frankly, nothing. Pointless. So that's where I see my patriotism, in saying, don't involve ourselves that are not necessary. Indeed, upscale our country first. Upscale our country. Why do we want to upscale our military when we don't? When the rest of the country is being downscaled? That doesn't make any sense. So we upscale our military. We go to 5% and put more into the military. But everywhere you go, and literally everywhere you go, into every hospital, people are being treated in corridors, and there's a queue because, and the government states it, there is no money. So which is it? You can upscale the billions to put into the military, which we don't need to do. We should be creating a military to defend ourselves solely. Right? And if you believe in nuclear, well, there you've got all the defence you need in reality. Right? That would be it. So why are we upscaling the military when actually we could be looking after our citizenry here in the United Kingdom? Right? That's all I say. It's simple. And my big bugbear is, I was in the Ukraine in 2011. You know, you're giving it to a country that's a kleptocracy. I mean, I saw it there. People stealing left, right, and centre. Everything's being stolen, and the United States basically said, the NAO, National Audit Office, basically said, yeah, half of the money we've cut in, which is the hundreds of billions we've put in, has been stolen. So why would you give money to a land that's stealing the hundreds of billions, losing millions of people, well, a million and a half people, you know, 1.5 million soldiers dead, right? For what? Why would you do that? Now, some people turn around and say, oh, you're a Putin man. No, I'm not a Putin man. I'm not a Putin man in any way, shape or means. What I am is a man who sees reality. And I'm saying to you, you look at the reality yourselves. Don't let me tell you the reality. You look at the reality yourselves. You look at the fact that, I don't think it's on the internet anymore, that the BBC in 2016, 2015 could bring out a programme talking about Nazis in the Ukraine, right? The BBC brought that programme out. BBC's flagship programme, Panorama brought that programme out and saying that they were attacking their own people in the eastern regions where the Russian speakers are. The BBC saying that, not me. And now look for that programme on the internet, see if you find it. You definitely won't find it in the BBC archives anymore. This is the point I'm making. So why is it hidden from the BBC archives? When, 10 years ago, they were showing you that. Now, they're not showing you that. And the talks I had with the Ukrainians when I was there was basically saying, this is what we're going to do to the Eastern Ukrainians. Eastern Ukrainians, Russian speakers. Read for that, Russian speakers. Right? So what I'm saying is, it's not a matter of me being pro one thing and negative something else. I'm trying to be pro-British. I'm not, make Britain great again type of nonsense. But what I am trying to say is, look after yourself. Do things right. Stop spending stupid money on the military and start spending it on our people. Now, I know everybody's got this hiccup. Everybody's now started doing it. Germany, the once sensible country, has now started doing this nonsense of spending on their military and losing out in what they previously had in being able to have the best cars and the best, etc. Losing all that cheap energy they used to have to produce the best cars, the best televisions, the best washing machines, the best whatever, you name it, right? Now they're going down the route of upping their military. How much military stuff can you sell? Nowhere near the amount that you can sell in terms of everyday cars, etc., 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 right? So it's a fool's errand going down that route. It really is. It's nonsensical. And it's worse than that. And I've said it before on other shows. If you get your best scientists working on these things, your best industrialists working on these things, your best engineers working on these things, and they're all working in the military domain, where is the domain for general household goods? What happens is that's all given to China. Not given, they take it. Because they say, all right, Germans no longer putting their money into cars. Fantastic, we'll do that. So now they've got the best EV cars in the world, bar none. British no longer spending money on trains. They're spending money on the military. Brilliant. We now build the best trains in the world. And it goes on and on and on. Right? Because these people are building for the general consumption. And you know what the kicker is at the end of it? And I'll leave you with that, because it's all about following the money. The kicker at the end of it is this, and I've jumped around all over the world, but you understand why if you've been listening and you've continued listening. I'm going to leave it at that because it might be too much. But the best kicker in the world is the fact that the Chinese have actually gone into this build high-level capacity because others have been giving it up and gone down the military route because of stupidity, right? You know what the best kicker is? The best kicker is this. Once you create all these other things and you bring them to the highest level possible, you can then build your military up quite easily because you've got the latest level chips, you've got the latest level engineering capacity, you've got the latest level of vehicle capacity, you've got the latest level of aircraft capacity because you built it all in the civil industries. And now and then, these same people can do that work for the military if and when required. It's not rocket science. It's not rocket science, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah? That you really want to provide the world with what the world wants to buy. That's the secret. It's not, it's nothing new to it. We should be concentrating ourselves on producing what people in general want to buy, not producing things to kill people. Because in the end, if we get to the level where we're killing everybody, nobody's buying. And on that, ladies and gentlemen, I shall leave you. Hopefully you've enjoyed this week's more of a critical thinking episode, and hope you can think your way through what I've said. And hopefully subscribe, and I'll see you again next week.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.